Everything seemed perfectly normal, yet not quite. In his cabin on B deck, 17-year-old Jack Thayer had just called good night to his father and mother, Mr. and Mrs. John B. Thayer of Philadelphia. The Thayers had connecting staterooms, an arrangement compatible with Mr. Thayer's position as second vice president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Now, as young Jack stood buttoning his pyjama jacket, the steady hum of the breeze through the half-open portholes suddenly stopped. One deck below, Mr. and Mrs. Henry B. Harris sat in their cabin playing double Canfield. Mr. Harris, a Broadway producer, was dog-tired, and Mrs. Harris had just broken her arm. There was little conversation as Mrs. Harris idly watched her dresses sway on their hangers from the ship's vibration. Suddenly, she noticed they stopped jiggling. Another deck below, Lawrence Beasley, a young science master at Dulwich College, lay in his second-class bunk reading, pleasantly lulled by the dancing motion of the mattress. Suddenly, the mattress was still. The creaking woodwork, the distant rhythm of the engines, the steady rattle of the glass dome over A-deck foyer, all the familiar shipboard sounds vanished as the Titanic glided to a stop. Far more than any jolt, silence stirred the passengers. Steward bells began ringing, but it was hard to learn anything. "Why have we stopped?" Lawrence Beasley asked the passing steward. "I don't know, sir," came a typical answer, "but I don't suppose it's much." Mrs. Arthur Ryerson of the Steele family had somewhat better results. "There's talk of an iceberg, ma'am," explained Steward Bishop, "and they have stopped not to run over it." While her French maid Victorine hovered in the background, Mrs. Ryerson pondered what to do. Mr. Ryerson was having the first good sleep since the start of the trip, and she hated to wake him. She walked over to the square, heavy glass window that opened directly on the sea. Outside she saw only a calm, beautiful night. She decided to let him sleep. Others refused to let well alone. With the restless curiosity that afflicts everyone on board ship, some of Titanic's passengers began exploring for an answer. In C-51, Colonel Archibald Gracie, an amateur military historian by way of West Point and an independent income, methodically donned underwear, long stockings, shoes, trousers, a Norfolk jacket, and then puffed up to the boat deck. Jack Thayer simply threw an overcoat over his pyjamas and took off, calling to his parents that he was going out to see the fun. On deck there was little fun to be seen, nor was there any sign of danger. For the most part, the explorers wandered aimlessly about or stood by the rail staring into the empty night for some clue to the trouble. The Titanic lay dead in the water, 3 of her 4 huge funnels blowing off steam with a roar that shattered the quiet starlit night. Otherwise, everything was normal. Towards the stern of the boat deck, an elderly couple strolled arm in arm, oblivious to the roaring steam and the little knots of passengers roving about. It was so bitterly cold and there was so little to be seen that most of the people came inside again. Entering the magnificent foyer on A deck, they found others who had also risen but preferred to stay inside where it was warm. Mingling together, they made a curious picture. Their dress was an odd mixture of bathrobes, evening clothes, fur coats, turtleneck sweaters. The setting was equally incongruous. The huge glass dome overhead, the dignified oak panelling, the magnificent balustrades with their wrought iron scrollwork, and looking down on them all, an incredible wall clock adorned with 2 bronze nymphs, somehow symbolising honour and glory crowning time. "Oh, it'll be a few hours and we'll be on our way again," the steward vaguely explained to first-class passenger George Harder. "Looks like we've lost a propeller, but it'll give us more time for bridge," called Howard Case, the London manager of Vacuum Oil, to Fred Seward, a New York lawyer. Perhaps Mr. Case got his theory from Steward Johnson, still contemplating a sojourn in Belfast. In any event, most of the passengers had better information by this time. "What do you think?" exclaimed Harvey Collier to his wife as he returned to their cabin from a tour around the deck. "We've struck an iceberg, a big one, but there's no danger. An officer told me so." The Colliers were travelling second class on their way from Britain to a fruit farm just purchased in Fayette Valley, Idaho. They were novices on the Atlantic, and perhaps the news would have roused Mrs. Collier, but the dinner that night had been too rich. So she just asked her husband if anybody seemed frightened, and when he said no, she lay back again in her bunk. John Jacob Astor seemed equally unperturbed. Returning to his suite after going up to investigate, he explained to Mrs. Astor that the ship had struck an ice, but it didn't look serious. He was very calm, and Mrs. Astor wasn't a bit alarmed. "What do they say is the trouble?" asked William T. Stead, a leading British spiritualist, reformer, evangelist and editor, all rolled into one. A professional individualist, he seemed almost to have planned his arrival on deck later than the others. "Icebergs," briefly explained Frank Millet, a distinguished American painter. "Well," Stead shrugged, "I guess it's nothing serious. I'm going back to my cabin to read."